The guns of World War I fell silent. Europe was in ruins, cities scarred, nations broken. But in America, the sound that replaced the cannons was the low, steady hum of engines, Ford engines. Henry Ford's factories had built trucks and ambulances for the front lines. When the war ended, those same factories stood ready to rebuild a broken world. Ford believed the automobile could be the cure for chaos, a machine that connected, not destroyed. By 1919, the Model T wasn't just a car, it was a revolution on four wheels. It carried workers, farmers, and dreamers from isolation to opportunity. Roads that once saw horses now echoed with the rattle of steel and the rhythm of industry. Ford's dream was simple, mobility for all. But behind the dream was obsession. The man who built an empire from steel and sweat now wanted to control every step of the process, from the mines that produced the ore to the rubber trees that fed his tires. At the Rouge River plant, the air was thick with the smell of oil and ambition. It wasn't just a factory, it was a world unto itself. Ships, trains, furnaces, and machines, all working in perfect harmony. Each day a new car rolled out, crafted by thousands of hands that moved like parts of a living machine. But those hands belonged to men, and men grow tired. Beneath the gleam of progress lay exhaustion, fear, and discipline. Ford's system was efficient, but it was relentless. Workers were monitored, timed, and measured down to the second. The machine demanded perfection, and perfection left no room for weakness. Mid-1920s, the American dream on wheels. By 1925, Ford had changed the rhythm of America itself. The Model T had conquered the countryside, made the middle class mobile, and turned highways into veins of commerce and culture. Families drove to towns they'd never seen. Goods traveled farther, faster. The automobile became freedom, and Ford its profit. But success brought enemies. Competitors rose. General Motors, with its colors, styles, and yearly updates, began to lure buyers who wanted more than simplicity. While Ford offered one car for every man, GM offered a car for every dream. Inside the Ford empire, cracks began to show. Henry's insistence on control grew harder. He distrusted unions, bankers, and even his own managers. The man who once symbolized progress now feared change. Still, Ford pressed forward. In 1927, the world gathered to watch the last Model T roll off the line. 15 million cars, a number unthinkable before him. It was the end of an era and the beginning of another. The next chapter was the Model A, sleeker, stronger, modern. He called it a car built to carry the future. But the world outside was changing faster than even he could predict. The factories roared with pride, but whispers filled the air, of falling stock prices, of deaths rising overseas, of a storm forming on the horizon. And as the sun set over Detroit's skyline, the glow of molten steel reflected on faces that had seen too much labor and too little rest. America was booming, but Ford could feel it. Something was shifting beneath the surface. The empire he built was made of iron, but the world ahead would demand something harder. Resilience. Because peace never lasts forever.
When the calendar flipped into 1930, Ford rolled into the decade with big main character energy, but the macro environment, it wasn't vibing. The Great Depression hit like a system-wide operational outage, and the American economy basically soft-launched chaos. Markets crashed, banks collapsed, and millions faced layoffs. Inside the Ford ecosystem, the metrics went red instantly. Car sales didn't decline, they straight up cratered. Inventory stalled. The Model A wasn't moving at scale. Traffic to showrooms went from high intent to ghost town. And the Ford Motor Company, a brand built on momentum, suddenly found itself trying to optimize inside a recession that had zero chill. The workers felt it first. Men who once clocked in with pride were now standing outside factory gates waiting for any indication they were still part of the operational roadmap. Ford had long promised security, a job today, a job tomorrow. But when the cash flow contracted, that promise hit a brick wall. Pay cuts landed, shifts shrank, and the anxiety off the charts. The River Rouge plant, once the most iconic industrial flex on the planet, now echoed with silence and tension. Thousands of employees lined up daily, hungry for hours, hungry for wages, hungry for certainty. The American dream was suddenly on performance review. And as pressure mounted, Ford doubled down on control. He deployed his infamous service department, a corporate security force with compliance optimization as their entire personality. They monitored workers, they intimidated union organizers, they treated any attempt to negotiate as a hostile takeover. But by the early 1930s, the UAW wasn't just organizing, they were scaling. The labor movement was gaining traction, and Ford's no-union policy? Yeah, it was aging like milk. Employees were done being silent stakeholders in a system that ran them to exhaustion. Tension at the Rouge escalated until it combusted in 1932 at the Ford Hunger March. It wasn't a protest, it was desperation. Thousands of unemployed workers walked to the Rouge demanding what they had lost: dignity, livelihood, basic human bandwidth. What happened next became a stain on Ford's brand reputation. Security forces and local police opened fire. 4 men died. Dozens were injured. Detroit was shaken. Ford publicly denied responsibility, but the damage had already hit the cultural ledger. Still, even with the internal culture crisis, the company kept pushing its engineering roadmap. Ford needed innovation to come in clutch, something that would reignite demand. And in 1932, he dropped a product that literally shifted the trajectory of automotive history: the Flathead V8. One engine, one design, one absolute disruption. Affordable, powerful, accessible. A blue sky innovation moment in an otherwise grim decade. America fell in love with horsepower again. Bootleggers used it. Police departments used it. Everyday drivers felt like they were commanding a performance-grade machine without a luxury tier price tag. Ford was back in the chat, but the economy was still shaky, and corporate optimism could only carry so far. While the U.S. battled unemployment, Europe was quietly ramping up towards something darker. Hitler's new regime in Germany began industrial mobilization, and Ford's foreign subsidiaries found themselves operating in a geopolitical gray zone. Henry Ford's own public opinions, isolationist, anti-war, and often controversial in all the wrong ways, fueled speculation. His newspaper writings had already sparked chaos, and now, with Germany expanding its military infrastructure, observers questioned how deeply Ford's overseas branches were integrated into the supply chain. The company insisted it was neutral, hyper-focused on manufacturing continuity, not politics. But outside perception, yeah, it got messy. Historians still debate the scale and intent, yet the reality remains. Ford's global footprint brushed up against a regime preparing for war. By 1937, the UAW was done waiting. They pulled up with real organizing power, real community backing, and a real mandate. Sit-down strikes hit competitors first. GM and Chrysler fell, one after another. Ford was the last player still holding the no union, no compromise line. And then came the Battle of the Overpass, a PR disaster in 4K before cameras were even a thing. UAW organizers handed out flyers at the Rouge. Ford's service department rolled in hot, swinging fists instead of negotiating terms. The photos went public. The nation saw it. The brand image tanked overnight. Ford tried to delay the inevitable, but 1941 forced settlement. The company finally recognized the union. Ford's workers gained bargaining power. Wages strengthened. The era of unchecked industrial control was officially sunsetted. And just in time, because a global conflict was about to light up every factory on Earth. World War II was rising, and Ford, whether ready or not, would pivot from peacetime production to full wartime scaling. The giant was waking up, and the next decade wouldn't just redefine Ford, it would redefine the world.
When 1939 hit, the global operating environment basically hard pivoted from uncertain markets to full-scale geopolitical meltdown. Europe went into conflict mode, borders lit up, and the world's supply chains started glitching. Ford watched the chaos from the US, still telling itself it could stay neutral, stay streamlined, stay in its own lane. But reality was about to pull the company directly into the war room. Once France fell in 1940, once Britain started taking hits every night, once the Axis momentum started moving like a high-velocity rollout, the US realized it couldn't just sit in read-only mode. And industrial giants like Ford, they weren't just going to be spectators, they were about to become the engine room of the entire Allied strategy. Inside Ford headquarters, the shift was instant. Executives started modeling what wartime production could look like at scale. Military officials walked the Rouge floors, assessing capabilities. Engineers pulled up old designs, tweaking them for aviation and armored vehicles. Suddenly, Ford wasn't thinking about cars, it was thinking about bombers, tanks, jeeps, generators, aircraft engines, the whole logistical stack. The company that once optimized for horsepower was about to optimize for survival. And then, the government dropped the gauntlet. Build a bomber plant big enough to change the war. Ford answered with Willow Run, the most ambitious manufacturing flex in American history. A facility so massive it needed its own ecosystem, so wide it had its own weather, so wild that people across the country talked about it like it was science fiction. The goal? Build B-24 Liberators not one at a time, but assembly line style. The same approach that made Ford a peacetime juggernaut, now repurposed to fight fascism. Willow Run became the moment Ford went full arsenal of democracy. Construction crews worked around the clock. Thousands of new workers poured in from across the map. Farmhands, students, former factory workers, single mothers, older men who thought their labor years were done. They filled jobs that didn't exist 6 months earlier. Many lived in brand new housing built fast just to feed the workforce pipeline. This wasn't just a plant, it was an industrial city spun up from scratch. But scaling up wartime production was messy. Willow Run stumbled out of the gate. Missed quotas, training bottlenecks, engineering recalibrations. Reporters mocked it. Critics called it a failure. But Ford doubled down, retooling workflows, onboarding talent, and stabilizing the operation until the numbers turned insane. 1 B-24 every hour. A bomber rolling off the line like it was a consumer product. No one had ever seen throughput like that in aviation. The Axis didn't just lose air advantage, they lost pace. Beyond Willow Run, Ford factories nationwide became multi-platform manufacturing hubs. The company built tanks, engines, armored vehicles, gliders, military tractors, generators. If it needed wheels, wings, or torque, Ford was probably involved. Women surged into the workforce, filling technical roles, machining parts, welding, assembling, proving their capability long before society was ready to admit it.
Whole teams operated with a zero-ego workflow because output wasn't just productivity, it was global survival. Ford even developed the Jeep under military contract, a tiny vehicle with main character energy that reshaped battlefield mobility. It could climb, it could tow, it could move across terrain that seemed undrivable. Officers loved it, troops trusted it. It became a symbol of Allied grit, simple, durable, unstoppable. Meanwhile, Henry Ford, older, slower, and out of sync with wartime intensity, watched as his son Edsel carried most of the operational load. Edsel pushed modernization, built partnerships, and kept the company aligned with military demand. But the pressure crushed him. By 1943, stressed and exhausted, Edsel died unexpectedly at 49. The factory floors paused, the workers mourned, the entire company felt the hit. It wasn't just a corporate loss, it was a cultural one. Henry returned to leadership briefly, but age had caught up with him. The company ran like a giant running on fumes, until the Ford board made a decisive call: bring in Henry Ford III, Edsel's son, to stabilize and rebuild the post-war future. A leader forged not by nostalgia, but necessity. Young, adaptive, ready to drag the company into a new century. When the war finally ended in 1945, Ford had delivered more than 8,000 B-24 Liberators, tens of thousands of military vehicles, and millions of essential components. The Allies didn't win because of one company, but they couldn't have won without the industrial ecosystem Ford helped build. The brand that once struggled with strikes, chaos, and economic collapse had reinvented itself as a wartime anchor. And when peace returned, Ford faced the same question every major industrial player did. What happens when the world no longer needs tanks, bombers, and battlefield mobility? The answer wasn't simple, but one thing was clear: Ford had leveled up. It had transformed from a car manufacturer into an industrial powerhouse capable of building anything the world could imagine.